Hello, my name is Dr. Elizabeth Searing, and I'm currently an assistant professor at the University at Albany in Albany, New York, which is in upstate New York. I've been asked by Dennis Young, who's the founder of the National Center of Nonprofit Enterprise, to say a couple words on one of my favorite financial topics, which in this case is something called overhead. As systemic minimization of overhead costs, which we defined as both management and admin and fundraising costs. In our study, and you can see on your screen one of the things that we found was that the impact of this minimization was divided between fundraising costs, which had actually increased slightly. And we thought it was relatively straightforward because we had confined ourselves to the notion of overhead as portrayed by the functional expenses reported in the Form 990. But what many people have realized, and what I did a few years later, was that the definition of overhead was a lot more nuanced. Was asked a few years later to do a project for New York State looking at the feasibility of a minimum overhead allowance for nonprofits getting state contracts, similar to a system that is used by people who receive, or nonprofits who receive federal government contracts. What we found was that overhead actually meant many things to many different people. But it turns out that some people use the word overhead to mean administrative expenses, while others used it to describe indirect expenses. And administrative actually applies to the function of the expense, whereas indirect describes how it is allocated to different cost centers. It's kind of like describing a lion. It's a carnivore, it eats meat, that's what it does. And it's also found in the African savanna. Now, both of these statements are true, but they're just describing different elements of the lion. And a random cat can be one or the other characteristics, or both, or neither. So in the chart that I'm showing now, we show a nonprofit with 3 different contracts. Each contract has programmatic and administrative components, and the nonprofit organization has direct and indirect costs that are allocated on an organization-wide basis. And there's overlap. But trying to design policy around a single word, in this case overhead, that has different meanings is extremely difficult, especially in this case where federal contracts tended to use indirect and the state contracts tended to mean administrative. Fast forwarding to today, I'm working in several international projects, including one that involves comparing overhead rates across international boundaries. And what we're finding is that even hard-coded in the annual filings that are required by different nations, some nations, like the United States Form 990, will focus on the administrative cost, while other nations will focus on the indirect or support costs. And so we are going to spend a sizable chunk of the paper getting into what the different implications of all of these definitions mean. So I guess there are 2 lessons to be taken here. The first, as I mentioned, is always make sure that you talk to people in the field. As an academic, there's a lot of conceptions around there being an ivory tower, and they're true. So what needs to happen is, if you're going to understand and give managerial advice, what you need to do is actually go out and talk to managers and understand the meaning of the words that you're researching. And the second is that even if you think that the project is strictly numerical, that it's just an accounting question, it's never just an accounting question, because the rules were devised by people in institutions, in countries and states that have been situated in histories and cultures and norms, and all of those are going to be reflected in the rules that you are currently reading about accounting. So it's never a straightforward question, and be sure that you talk to everyone you can about how the different words are interpreted.